So I've been asked to give a brief synopsis of my paper, and the shorter talk I gave, of course, on restoring a sense of radical empiricism in religion and science. If we look at the history of science, going back to Galileo, it was a wonderful spirit of radical empiricism that led Galileo to use better and better technology to make direct observations of celestial phenomena, such as the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, the spots on the sun, the craters on the moon, but also to make very rigorous observations, measurements of terrestrial physical phenomena. And so this is what actually catalyzed the scientific revolution. And likewise, 250 years later, we have Charles Darwin again carefully observing the phenomena he's seeking to understand and coming up with a brilliant theory with great explanatory power of human beings as a species in terms of our survival and procreation. The theory of evolution leaves out an enormous amount about human existence, human nature, but it does have great explanatory power in terms of our animal nature, our survival and procreation. When it comes to the mind, though, the scientific community has thrown to the winds the spirit of radical empiricism, which would require us to carefully observe the mind with as much rigor, sophistication, precision as we possibly can, as all other branches of natural science have done for their respective fields. When it comes to the mind, the dogma of scientific materialism, the insistence that the only phenomena that exist are the objective, physical, and quantifiable, and the insistence that the only proper methodologies are by looking outwards, has completely stifled the spirit of radical empiricism in the mind sciences. And so, as I quoted Eric Kandel, who's a Nobel laureate, a very eminent neuroscientist, when he so, candidly expresses what is the aim of modern science, the aim is to try to find empirical belief to support a belief they've already adopted that doesn't have support. And that is that mental phenomena are simply biological processes in the brain. There's in fact no evidence that they are. There's no evidence that the brain produces consciousness. There's no evidence whatsoever that mental phenomena, subjective experience, is physical. You can't measure it physically, and when you observe the mind subjectively, introspectively, all of these mental events display no physical attributes whatsoever. Nevertheless, these people, the advocates of scientific materialism, place greater weight on their metaphysical beliefs than they do on empirical evidence. In other words, the spirit of empiricism has vanished from the mind sciences because they refuse to develop any sophisticated means for observing the mind directly. This great weakness has actually prevented any type of true revolution in the mind sciences because it's bogged down in the dogma of scientific materialism. Now, Buddhism, a tradition to which I've been devoting my life for the last 48 years, in study, practice, teaching, translating, Buddhists are as prone to dogmatism as anybody else. I'm sure I am prone to dogmatism. I try to ward it off, but we are all prone to it. But if we look at the ideals of the Buddha himself, the Buddhist tradition at its best, from the very beginning, the theme of ehipassy, come and see, the theme of pragmatism and empiricism that the Buddha so strongly emphasizes in the Kalama Sutta, show that this is really very much to the core of Buddhism, that we're not relying simply on dogma, on belief, on received wisdom, or let alone what society believes. So the notion, and I've heard this expressed today in the afternoon, that what we regard as Buddhism now is simply a reflection of the worldview of ancient India, is a statement without any basis in empirical fact at all. Because at the time of the Buddha, there was no Indian worldview. It was tremendously pluralistic. There were theists and non-theists. People believed in personal God and an impersonal God, believed in many gods and no gods. There were materialists and there were agnostics. And so the notion that the Buddha would pick up themes like karma and reincarnation because it was in the air that everybody believed it, just shows a total ignorance of the situation in India at the time of the Buddha. His views were revolutionary. He claimed that they were on the basis of his own direct perception. So the notion that he just picked them up makes him both a hypocrite as well as a very superficial thinker, that he taught reincarnation just because other people said so. I find this utterly denigrating of the Buddha, and it's basically worth laughter and not even refutation. But Buddhists can be dogmatists, and it does happen. And so what I was encouraging in my lecture is that we return to the ideals of radical empiricism, questioning our assumptions, not only the beliefs of other people, but our own assumptions in science and in Buddhism as well, and that we reinvigorate the spirit of contemplative inquiry in Buddhism and hopefully in other contemplative traditions of the world. Because great discoveries have been made. They have been replicated hundreds upon hundreds of times about the nature of the mind, dimensions of the mind, the continuity of consciousness from lifetime to lifetime. And to treat these as mere superstition or cultural artifacts and so forth, I find to be frankly racist, ethnocentric, and an expression of cultural chauvinism. So there's nothing there that I respect. But it's not enough to simply be saying in the past Buddhists had very profound realizations. To my mind, this is the great adventure, the great opportunity, and the great responsibility of people like myself, who have a very profound reverence and confidence in the Buddhist tradition, for us to try to replicate, to explore for ourselves, using these time-tested methods of shamatha, vipassana, and so on, to make these discoveries, but not just to keep them private, but rather to make these discoveries in full-scale collaboration with open-minded scientists. So working together with scientists, not religion versus science, or Buddhism versus any other spiritual tradition, but coming together with an open mind, using modes of contemplative inquiry, using modes of scientific inquiry, together collaboratively with mutual respect, with trained professionals on the contemplative side, trained contemplatives on the scientific side, and see if by so doing we might trigger or help to trigger a true revolution in the mind sciences and a true renaissance in contemplative inquiry. The notion that Buddhism should adapt to modernity is suggesting that Buddhism should adapt to materialism, hedonism, and consumerism, and this is to say Buddhism should adapt to this triad that's actually destroying the ecosphere and undermining human civilization. This seems to me one of the craziest ideas that's ever been posed, that Buddhism should conform to a worldview which is fundamentally rooted in ignorance, hedonism, which is rooted in superficiality, and consumerism, which is destroying the planet. Buddhism is an alternative to materialism, hedonism, and consumerism, and we should hold to our position, not in a rigid or dogmatic way, but in a way that is authentic to what the Buddha taught. Insights have been replicated for many, many times, to an actual sense of refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. People who don't have any trust in the Buddha, don't have trust in the teachings attributed to him, and don't have trust in the Sangha, who've been preserving these teachings for the last 2,500 years, really have no business calling themselves Buddhist. Why don't they just say, this is what I believe, and leave Buddhism to Buddhists? That's my view.